You are listening to The Evidence Locker. Our cases have been researched using open source and archive materials. It deals with true crimes and real people. Each episode is produced with the utmost respect to the victims, their families, and loved ones. In South Dakota, in the late 19th century, settlers and natives were living together in harsh conditions. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 acknowledged Lakota's sovereignty over the Great Plains, provided settlers had safe passage on their land. But as white people settled on the land and not simply travel through, they were considered to be a threat in the battle for natural resources. The Lakota protected their land, and with support of other native tribes, managed to destroy half of Custer's regiment in the Battle of Little Bighorn, or Custer's last stand. It was an overwhelming victory for the Native Americans. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The Lakota held the Black Hills as sacred, and they objected to settlers mining in the area. This issue became the main point of contention between Native Americans and the U.S. government. In 1877, the government seized the Black Hills and sent in more troops to defuse any resistance. The U.S. Army fought the Lakota in order to protect miners and settlers living and working in the area. The Lakota community worked the land and were determined to stay in the area. But South Dakota is dry, and the soil is not very fertile. So the crops were not growing all that well. The Army also killed off buffalo in an attempt to push the Lakota out of the area. The tribe called upon higher powers for help and practiced the ghost dance. This ritual was believed to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. Practitioners would call on the spirits of their ancestors to help them in driving Europeans out of the area and bring all Native American tribes peace and prosperity. The government wanted people from the other side of the Missouri River to assimilate into Christian English culture. Native American children had to attend English boarding schools, and they were not allowed to speak their native language or learn native history. If children tried to talk about anything regarding their culture, they were beaten. The consistent practice of the ghost dance unnerved settlers, and in 1890, thousands of troops were sent to the Standing Rock Reservation. They went to arrest Sitting Bull for allowing his people to do the ghost dance. This is when one of Chief Sitting Bull's men, Catch the Bear, fired at Lieutenant Bullhead and hit him in his side. Bullhead retaliated by shooting Sitting Bull. Both men died. 2 weeks later, tensions between the two groups came to a head. Army officers collected weapons from a band of Lakota on the banks of the Wounded Knee Creek. A young deaf Lakota called Black Coyote refused to give up his weapon, and in a struggle, the gun fired into the air. The command to open fire was given to the U.S. troops and mayhem ensued. At the end of the relentless shooting, more than 300 people were killed. Of the victims, 153 Lakota were women and children. 25 U.S. troops also died, most of them shot by their own side. Oglala Lakota chief American Horse relayed the story of what took place on that cold December day. There was a woman with an infant in her arms who was killed as she almost touched the flag of truce. A mother was shot down with her infant. The child, not knowing that its mother was dead, was still nursing. The women, as they were fleeing with their babies, were killed together, shot right through. And after most of all of them had been killed, a cry was made that all those who were not killed or wounded should come forth and they would be safe. Little boys came out of their places of refuge, and as soon as they came in sight, a number of soldiers surrounded them and butchered them there. Hugh McGinnis of the 7th Cavalry remembered the aftermath. General Nelson A. Miles, who visited the scene of carnage, following a 3-day blizzard, estimated that around 300 snow-shrouded forms were strewn over the countryside. He also discovered to his horror that helpless children and women with babies in their arms had been chased as far as 2 miles from the original scene of encounter and cut down without mercy by the troopers. Judging by the slaughter on the battlefield, it was suggested that the soldiers simply went berserk. For who could explain such a merciless disregard for life? As I see it, the battle was more or less a matter of spontaneous combustion, sparked by mutual distrust. This confrontation left a scar on South Dakota history forever. It laid the foundation for the relationship between Lakota people and the white community. 100 years later, the disappearance of an 18-year-old Lakota teenager brought mutual hatred and distrust to the surface once again. Today, Standing Rock Reservation is just a short distance away from the town of Mobridge, with the Missouri River flowing in between. Throughout the years, the river has served as the dividing force between the reservation and the town, between the Lakota and the white population. The great Lakota chief, Sitting Bull, is buried on the hills overlooking the landscape of windswept plains. People from the Lakota tribe honor tradition and live in harmony with their natural surroundings. They hunt buffalo. Despite tradition, many Lakota tribe members need to work in Mobridge to generate income. The area made recent news with the Standing Rock Sioux opposing the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline. In 2015, the tribe stated that the pipeline poses a serious risk to the very survival of our tribe and would destroy valuable cultural resources. The issue was reminiscent of the Black Hills controversy all those years ago. This time, many people supported the protest, including A-list celebrities. At the time of publication of this episode, the pipeline issue is still being protested, and the outcome still uncertain. Mobridge is a small farming town about 500 miles or 800 kilometers northwest of Sioux Falls. About 3,500 people call Mobridge home. The town lies on the banks of the Missouri River, and a short bridge crossing connects to Standing Rock Reservation to the west of the river. The landscape is an endless panorama of flat grass plains. There is a clear distinction between the town and the reservation. Unemployment in the reservation is more than 60%. Back in 1980, the class distinction between Lakota peoples and the white population of Mobridge was obvious. There was a large sense of mutual intolerance between the two groups. Prejudice was rife. Native Americans were not allowed in certain shops, with signs in the windows that read, "No Indians." The area has been called the Mississippi of the North because of racial tension. The white population felt that the unemployment was largely due to the excessive drinking and lack of ambition. They could also not understand the culture of having large families with little means of providing for them. Not all members of the two communities hated each other, however. They went to school together, worked together, they lived together, and even socialized together. Alberta Left-Hand Rough Surface was 18 years old when she married Ted Martin, and the couple had a little boy they called Homer. They lived in a reservation town near Mobridge called Kennel. Alberta broke horses and called herself an old cowgirl. Sadly, everything changed when both her husband and son passed away. Throughout her life that followed, Alberta married 3 more times and had many children. She lost another child, one of 2 twin girls at birth. Coping with the sadness of her loss, she focused on her living children and was known to be a warm and caring mother. All the neighborhood kids loved her, especially around Halloween, when she made candy-filled bags for all the trick-or-treaters. In 1980, all of Alberta's children were grown up, and only her 18-year-old daughter, Candi, lived with her. Candace Patricia Rough Surface was born on the 18th of October, 1961, to Alberta and Daniel Rough Surface. They separated when Candi was young, and Daniel remarried. Candi was the second youngest of 10 children, and the youngest daughter in the family. She was always kind and caring, and wasn't scared of anything. Her family described her as quiet and pretty, but there was more to her. Candi was always up for an adventure and willing to try something new or daring. She dropped out of school during her sophomore year when she fell pregnant to her boyfriend, a Lakota teenager called Tommy Eagle. He left her when he heard that she was pregnant. Candi wasn't too fazed, as she was a bright and confident young woman who could make it on her own. When her son, who she named Homer, was born, Candi grew up quickly. But thanks to support of her mother and family, She could work and provide for herself and her son. She worked as a cleaner at the local college in Mobridge, 5 days a week, but she felt that it was a temporary situation. Candi had dreams. She wanted to finish school and study so she could get a good job and create a better life for her and Homer. On Friday afternoon, August 2nd, 1980, Candi went home after a day's work. It was payday. She was ready to go out and have some fun. After spending some time with Homer and putting him to bed, she kissed her mother goodbye and headed out for a night on the town. Her mother didn't mind taking care of Homer, as she wanted Candi to enjoy what was left of her teens. Candi was a responsible mother who loved being with her child. But letting off some steam once in a while was a good thing, her mother thought. The night kicked off at the Silver Dollar Bar in Mobridge. Candi went there with her sister Clara and her sister's boyfriend, but felt like a fifth wheel, so she told him that she wanted to go somewhere else. In Mobridge 1980, it was legal for 18-year-olds to consume low alcohol beer, so Candi had had a couple of drinks. Clara tried to convince her to stay and hang out with them, but being the tag-along wasn't quite Candi's idea of fun. This was the last time Clara would see her sister alive. The next morning, Alberta was worried when she realized her daughter never came home when she saw that Candi's bed had not been slept in. It wasn't unusual for Candi to come home in the early morning hours or to stay over at a friend's place, but she would always be home by the time Homer woke up. Alberta called Clara, who told her that Candi had gone her own way the night before, and Clara did not know where she went after leaving the Silver Dollar. Both Clara and Alberta were worried, as it was very much out of character for Candi to go AWOL. They drove around the reservation and Mobridge, but could not find any sign of Candi. Clara took matters in her own hands and decided to ask all of the young people in the reservation if they had seen Candi the night before. 2 girls that had gone to school with Candi told Clara that they did see her. The girls were not friends of Candi's, but they knew her well. The girls said that they saw her at a bar called the Joker's Wild. Teenagers liked going there because they catered for a younger crowd. The girls exchanged a couple of words, but did not see anyone with Candi, and they left before she did. As Clara went around the reservation, multiple youngsters confirmed the story that placed Candi at Joker's Wild, but no one remembered seeing her with anyone else. After looking for Candi over the weekend and still finding no trace of her, Alberta decided to go to the police. Lakota people are typically skeptical of police. As Alberta had anticipated, police did not offer much help. They told her that Candi probably just ran off. She was a teenage mother. Perhaps things were getting a little bit too hard for her. Alberta didn't buy it. She didn't just leave it there and eventually persuaded law enforcement to look into her daughter's case. Police went to Joker's Wild and asked if anyone had seen Candi on the night of her disappearance. No one had seen her. After probing deeper, the name Nick Scher came up. A bartender said that he saw Candi having a drink with Nick. The Schers was a well-to-do family in Mobridge. Nick's older twin brothers, Bill and Jim, were both Olympic wrestlers and both brought home bronze medals. They were seen as local heroes, and the town sports arena was named after them, the Scher Howe Center, sharing the name with Native American artist Oscar Howe, who had painted murals inside the building in 1942. Nick was the youngest brother. When police questioned him, he admitted that he was at Joker's Wild on that Friday night. When he was asked about Candi, he said that he saw her there, but he left early and didn't know anything more. He said that there were many people from out of town in the bar that night, whom he didn't know. It was a dead end. Police were satisfied that Nick did not know what had happened to the missing teen. Another person of interest was Homer's dad. Police found Tommy Eagle and asked him about Candi, if there was bad blood between them. Tommy said that he hardly ever saw her. When asked about his whereabouts on the 2nd of August, he said he was at home with friends and the alibi checked out. Tommy definitely did not see Candi the night she went missing. Months went by, and there was still no sign of Candi. The Lakota people came together and searched the reservation on horseback. The support for the Rough Surface family was strong. The community was not about to give up the search. Reports of sightings came in from time to time, some from as far away as Minneapolis, others closer to home in Pierre, less than a 2-hour drive from Mobridge. Alberta would follow up with police on a regular basis, but nothing ever came up. Candi had simply vanished without a trace. As snow fell on the plains and ice froze the ground, Candi's family grew even more concerned. Where could she be? If she had run away, was she safe? Was she warm? At home, Alberta and Candi's siblings tried to save face and put up a brave front for Homer's sake. How could they tell him that no one knew where his mother was? As winter made way for spring in May 1981, the snow began to melt on the plains. A local ranch hand was on his four-wheeler, inspecting his boss's property when he saw something suspicious on the muddy banks of the Missouri River. He went closer to the shallow bay of Lake Oahe and saw that the strange object was a decomposing body. He alerted law enforcement and accompanied Walworth County Sheriff Jim Speary to the location. The sheriff saw the badly decomposed body and looked around the scene for any clues as to the identity of the deceased. The body had been exposed to the elements and was missing one leg, which was perhaps the work of local wildlife. In close proximity to the body, there was a pair of black-rimmed eyeglasses. The sheriff's mind went back to photos he had seen of Candace Rough Surface, and he immediately knew the glasses belonged to her. Post-mortem examination confirmed that the body was indeed Candi. She had most likely died in August the year before, on the night of her disappearance. The cause of death was 5 bullet wounds to the head. There was also evidence that she was raped before she was killed. Alberta and the Rough Surface family were struck down by shock and grief. At first, Alberta refused to believe that the murdered body was Candi. She clung to hope that Candi would return, desperately trying to believe the reported sightings were real. But once the autopsy results confirmed that the body was in fact Candi's, she had to face the horrible truth. The entire Lakota nation mourned her death. It seemed completely outlandish that a sweet, hard-working young woman like Candi would have met with such a violent death. Who could possibly have committed this heinous crime? Could it have been one of their own? Candi's murder was big news in the community of Mobridge. Because of her disappearance and the 8-month search for her, everyone knew about it. To know that she didn't run away and that she was murdered made the once-was-safe town more cautious when letting their daughters go out at night. For a while at least. But as the dust settled on the case, the residents went back to normal and carried on as if things never happened. Investigators had a difficult task in gathering information. The Caucasian residents of Mobridge were not very talkative either. They did not want to get mixed up in the death of a native woman, and information was sparse. At the reservation, Lakota people had grown suspicious of white police officers over the years, so no one was overly keen to talk there either. They would rather try and find Candi's killer themselves. Police were suspicious of the man who had found Candi's body, Steve Sheldon. The location of her body was very isolated, and the odds of simply stumbling upon her were not very good. Yet, he found her. Did he have anything to do with the murder? Police looked into that, but could not find anything linking him to it, and they had to leave it at that. Then there was a break in the case. 2 weeks after the discovery of Candi's body, a young man went into the Mobridge police station to give a statement. He said that, the day after Candi's disappearance, he went fishing with a friend near the spot where Candi's body was discovered. The date was significant to him, so he remembered exactly when it was. He said that they saw a strange man running wild on the banks of the river, and they thought it was pretty weird. He had no shirt on and was wearing only jeans. He was running away from them like they had frightened him. They assumed that he was high on drugs. The witness provided a description of the man, and an artist made up a composite drawing. But it did not bring in any new information. Nobody knew who the man in the picture was. When asked, the witness stated that he never knew Candi. His fishing buddy did. His name was Nick Scher, the same guy that was seen with Candi at Joker's Wild on her last night. Nick went to school with Candi's cousin, Rusty, and they saw each other around from time to time. Although it was the second time in the investigation that his name had surfaced, police could find no evidence that Nick had anything to do with Candi's death. whoever the strange shirtless man was is a mystery that has never been solved. Whether the story was true or not, one will probably also never know. Police had no further information until a month later when a tip was called in. The tip was called in by a teenage girl named Daisy, but she was very scared and did not want to go into the police station. She said that someone named Mike might know something about the murder. Police pushed her for more information, but in the end, she was too afraid to reveal anything more. And it was left at that. Whether police followed up about the man called Mike is not clear. But coming up to a year after Candi's murder, police still did not have any answers. The Lakota people felt that police weren't doing enough to look for Candi's killer. If Candi were a white girl from Mobridge, anything would have been done to solve the murder. Candi's family was distraught, and along with Lakota people, they pressured the authorities to act and find her killer, but there were no results. Then, in 1986, tragedy struck again. Candi's dad, Daniel Rough Surface, passed away. In a sick twist of fate, he too was found naked and raped. Daniel's body was found in the crawl space underneath an abandoned grain elevator, badly beaten and burnt. However, this case was solved immediately. The killer was his own nephew. Donald Rough Surface pled not guilty and said that he had killed his uncle after drinking together all day in a moment of insanity. He was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. But Candi's case was still not solved. 10 years went by without any answers. But then, in October 1995, the whole case cracked wide open when the unimaginable happened. Out of the blue, Mobridge police received a call from a woman living in Eagle River, Wisconsin. She said that her ex-son-in-law had information about the murder of a Native American girl in Mobridge in the 1980s. Her former son-in-law was 30-year-old James E. Straw II, known to his friends as Jimmy. Police made arrangements as soon as they could. They interviewed him at his home. Jimmy said that he was prepared to talk about Candi Rough Surface's murder, but he wanted police to ensure him that he would be able to get a plea deal. Eager to hear what he had to say, they agreed. Jimmy told them that in August 1980, he was 15 years old. His family stopped in Mobridge for a couple of days as part of their vacation, visiting relatives. He hung out with his cousin a lot during that week, and on the night of Candi's disappearance, they went to Joker's Wild. A name that had come up more than once over the years surfaced once again. Jimmy Straw's cousin was none other than Nick Scher. He also said that one of Nick's friends joined them, a guy called Mike. Remember that tipster Daisy told police to talk to a Mike? So police felt that there was some credence in Jimmy's story. According to Jimmy, Mike left early on and the two cousins stayed behind at Joker's Wild. That is when Nick saw Candi and invited her to join him and Jimmy for a drink. In another version, he said that Candi was drunk and came onto both of them. Either way, Candi joined the two cousins for a couple of drinks and they all hung out together. It was a fun night, but it was far from over. Nick and Jimmy had to leave as they were expected at a party on a ranch just outside of town. Nick invited Candi along, but she said no at first. Then he promised that he would take her home afterwards. Candi was always up for a bit of adventure, and this was something new, so hesitation went out the window, and she agreed to join them. Because Nick went to school with Candi's cousin, she knew him and didn't feel unsafe. Besides, everyone in town knew the Schers. She was in good hands, or so she thought. Nick, Jimmy, and Candi drove to the party. Nick's friend, who had invited them, Steve Sheldon, was the same guy that discovered Candi's body 9 months after she was killed. The night progressed with more drinking and socializing. Outside of Steve Sheldon's trailer home, there was a bonfire, and everyone mulled around, laughing and having a good time. Jimmy saw that Nick made advances on Candi, but it didn't look like Candi was interested. Nick persisted, tried to kiss her, and even pulled her onto his lap as she was sitting. The situation had become uncomfortable for Candi, and Candi told Nick to take her home to her son as he had promised he would do. Nick was furious, but he agreed. He called Jimmy, and the three of them jumped back into his pickup. Despite Candi's reluctance to make out with Nick, he still tried his luck with her as they drove home. Candi became agitated and told him to back off. She threatened the both of them. She said she knew some guy who would beat them up if they didn't stop. They probably laughed it off, and Candi turned around to slap Jimmy. The situation had reached a boiling point, and Nick flipped. He was insulted that Candi kept on rejecting him, and he was furious that she had slapped his cousin. In a fit of rage, he pulled his truck over next to the rural road and pushed Candi out of the car, aggressively dragging her out into a field. Jimmy had never seen his cousin this angry before and stayed in the truck. Nick was fuming and shouted. He ordered Jimmy out of the truck, saying that they were both going to do her. Jimmy stood by as he saw Nick beating up on Candi. Candi put up a fight, but Nick was too strong. As she lay defenseless on the ground, Nick unbuckled his belt and proceeded to rape her. When Nick was done, Jimmy had his turn with an injured and emotional Candi. Jimmy claimed he only went along with it as he was scared of Nick at that point in time. Candi cried. She whimpered. Nick told her to shut up. She was shaken up and could not stop crying. So that's when Nick went back to his truck to fetch his .22 caliber firearm. He marched back to the spot where she was lying and proceeded to shoot her again and again, twice in the back, 3 times behind her right ear. He then gave the gun to Jimmy and forced him to fire some shots off as well. Jimmy remembered pulling the trigger and firing 1 shot, but he wasn't sure if he had hit her body or not. Again, he said he only participated because he was afraid of what his cousin would do to him if he had refused. Candi was no longer alive, but they still had to dispose of her body. Nick didn't want any blood in his truck, so he fetched a chain from the back of his pickup. Jimmy helped him to wrap the chain around Candi's nude body to the bumper of his truck and drove towards the river, dragging her body along a dirt road, the distance of 1 mile. As a final insult, they took the money from her purse and split it between them before casting it aside. Jimmy kept this secret for 10 long years, nervously keeping an eye on the news for any developments in the case. In his mid-20s, he couldn't keep the story to himself any longer and started confiding in people about what he had done. In the end, he told around 10 people about the murder, close friends and family. The scary part is that nobody ever came forward to tell police about Jimmy's confessions. No one wanted to get involved and simply turned a blind eye. That is, until Jimmy's marriage turned sour. It was a bitter divorce, full of spite and vengeance. And that's when his ex-wife's mother played the biggest trump card she had. She told police about his part in Candi's murder. Whether her motive was finding justice for a murdered girl or simply getting her ex-son-in-law into trouble, one will never know. But whatever the reason, the Rough Surface family finally had their answers. It was time for police to talk to the man who had evaded justice for more than a decade. After all that time, Nick Scher was still living in Mobridge. He was married with children and worked as a diesel mechanic. Although Nick denied his cousin's accusation of killing Candi Rough Surface, Jimmy Straw's confession was enough to make an arrest. Before they knocked on his door, police managed to record a telephone conversation between Nick and Jimmy, in which Nick implicated himself in the murder. While awaiting trial, Jimmy Straw remained in custody, while Nick Scher was released on $200,000 bail. He carried on with his day-to-day life, working and spending time with his family. This angered the Lakota people. They waited so long for a resolution in the case. How could this man have his freedom, even if it was only until his trial? But the trial started in April 1996, and Alberta Rough Surface did not attend. When asked why not, she said, "I don't want to hear those things about my little girl. I don't think I could take it." Because both Nick and Jimmy were only 15 and 16 at the time of the crime, they were to be tried as juveniles. There was also no physical evidence against them, and the case was built on confessions. To avoid the death penalty, Nick Scher pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of manslaughter. He addressed the court and apologized to Candi's family. He said, "I did not mean for it to happen. I wish there was some way I could take it back. I kept it inside because I was afraid and I was ashamed. But his remorse did not soften his punishment. Sentenced to 100 years, his time was to be served outside of South Dakota for his own safety. 31-year-old Jimmy Straw's trial took place a month after Nick Scher's sentencing. He had a plea deal because he came forward with the information and testified against his cousin, so he was sentenced to 15 years for sexual assault and second-degree manslaughter. In the end, he was released in 2004 after serving only 8 years. Racial tension increased at the time of the arrests and the trial. It opened up old wounds. The Lakota people felt that they had still not seen justice for Candi. The sentencing was too light. They asked, what would the charges have been had 2 Lakota teens killed a white girl? The case divided the town of Mobridge. Nick Scher was eligible for parole after 13 years in 2009. Desperate to help her son, his mother started a petition, pleading for his release from prison. More than 100 people signed it, most of them white people from the town of Mobridge. Controversially, also the priest Father Ortmeyer, known affectionately by Native Americans as Chasing Cloud. Talk in town was that it all happened so long ago, and that the actions of the cousins were due to youthful indiscretion. In an interview, a local shopkeeper said, "These Indians, they kill each other all the time anyway. If they don't, they get drunk and freeze to death. It's kind of an everyday thing." The shopkeeper wanted to remain anonymous in the press, as he did not want to anger his Native American customers. Currently, Nick Scher, now 54 years old, has been granted parole and is set for release in 2019. He completed only 23 years of his 100-year sentence. Homer was not notified of the fact that his mother's murderer was getting out of prison. In an interview with Aberdeen News, 41-year-old Homer recalled Scher's previous parole hearing. Growing up without parents, no sibling, that was like one of the worst things in the world, not having anyone to turn to. Trying to cope with stuff like that and having to go to court when I was 14, that was probably one of the hardest things I've ever went through, was having to see him in court. To not even be notified, it seems like I should have had some kind of warning so I could prepare for something like this. I'd hate to be walking down the street. Homer ended it there. The news opened up the wounds of a lifetime of grief. Candi's case became an example for groups fighting injustice against Indigenous women. Justice for Candi became a strong case to prove the mission of their plight. In December 1995, 300 people marched from the Rough Surface home in Kennel to the murder site on the banks of Lake Oahe. In 2017, a nationwide vigil took place to honor and remember murdered Native American women. A researcher for Amnesty International, Carol Pollack, conducted a study into sexual violence against Native American and Alaska Native women. She said, 1 in 3 Native American and Alaska Native women will be raped at some point during their lives, and 86% of perpetrators of these crimes are non-Native men. Sexual violence against women from Indian nations is at epidemic proportions, and that Indian women face considerable barriers to accessing justice. In a similar effort is the #MeToo social media movement. #NotInvisible speaks up about violence against Native women. Although the Rough Surface family supported the plight for Native women, they never pushed for Candi to be the poster girl for injustice. They simply wanted justice for their daughter, sister, and mother. Alberta made her peace with the court's ruling and said that the Lord will hold the final verdict. It was a sad irony that her youngest daughter, Candi, brought a little boy named Homer back into Alberta's life, a haunting reminder of the first child she lost. Although Homer was cared for and loved by his grandmother, nothing would ever fill the void left by the loss of his sweet and caring mother, Candi. Alberta Rough Surface passed away in 2009 at the age of 85 to join her daughter in the afterlife. In Lakota tradition, it is believed that death is not an ending, but rather a transition to another way of being. One's spirit walks on to exist in a spirit world free from pain and suffering. And with Candi's murder resolved, Alberta believed that her daughter's spirit could finally be free. If you'd like to read more about this case, have a look at the resources used for this episode in the show notes. Also, visit and like our Facebook page at facebook.com/Evidence Locker Podcast to see more about today's case. If you like our podcast, please subscribe in Apple Podcast or Stitcher or wherever you get your podcasts. We would also appreciate if you could review the episodes, as it gives us some street cred in the world of podcasting. This was the Evidence Locker. Thank you for listening.